Picture this, you're a World War II pilot, soaring over the pristine blue waters of the Pacific. Below you, thousands of enemy soldiers float helplessly, clinging to debris and lifeboats. Their ships are gone. Their weapons are at the bottom of the ocean. They pose no immediate threat. Then your radio crackles to life with an order that will haunt you forever: kill every single one of them. Not capture. Not rescue. Kill. What you're about to hear is the true story of one of World War II's most morally complex battles, where American heroes became something else entirely. Where the line between military genius and mass murder disappeared in the spray of machine gun fire over the Bismarck Sea. This isn't just about strategy or tactics. This is about what happens when good men are ordered to do unspeakable things in the name of victory. And the terrifying part? It might have been the right call. Before we dive into this moral minefield, I need you to do something for me. If you're here for the untold, unvarnished stories of World War II, the ones they don't teach in textbooks, smash that subscribe button right now. Because what you're about to learn will change how you think about heroes, villains, and the brutal mathematics of war forever. Trust me, you've never heard this story before. And after today, you'll never forget it. March 1943. The Pacific is burning, and the Japanese Empire is bleeding out, island by island. But in the smoke-filled war rooms of Tokyo, desperate men are making one final, catastrophic gamble. General Hideki Tojo, Japan's iron-fisted prime minister, stares at a map of New Guinea. The island isn't just a dot in the Pacific, it's the keystone holding Japan's entire southern defense together. Lose New Guinea, and the path to Japan's homeland lies wide open. The situation is dire. Japanese forces at La are surrounded, outnumbered, and slowly starving. American bombers pound them daily. Australian ground forces are closing in. Without immediate reinforcement, the garrison will fall within weeks. But here's the problem: American air power now rules the skies over the Bismarck Sea. Sending a convoy through these waters isn't a mission, it's a death sentence. Every Japanese admiral knows it. Every pilot knows it. Even the soldiers being loaded onto the transports know it. Yet Tokyo makes the call anyway. Operation 81, they name it. The plan? Load 6,900 of Japan's finest troops, battle-hardened veterans from China, elite infantry units, artillery specialists, onto 8 heavily laden transport ships. Escort them with 8 destroyers bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Run the gauntlet through 600 miles of American-controlled airspace. It's not strategy. It's desperation wrapped in a prayer. Command of this suicide mission falls to Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, a career naval officer who's seen more battles than most men see birthdays. Kimura isn't naive, he knows the odds. His staff calculates they have perhaps a 30% chance of reaching La with half their ships intact. But Tokyo's message is clear: Japan's fate in New Guinea, perhaps the entire war, depends on this convoy reaching its destination. Failure is not an option, even if success means death. As Kimura's convoy steams out of Rabaul Harbor on March 1, 1943, Japanese sailors line the decks of the massive naval base, watching in silence. They're witnessing what many believe will be the last great Japanese convoy operation of the war. They have no idea how right they are. 1,200 miles southeast, at Port Moresby Airfield, Lieutenant General George Kenny is about to make military history. But first, let me paint you a picture of this man who will orchestrate one of the most devastating aerial assaults ever conceived. Kenny isn't your typical desk-bound general. At 53, he's a hands-on commander who still climbs into bombers and flies combat missions. His men respect him because he doesn't send them anywhere he wouldn't go himself. But what makes Kenny truly dangerous is his willingness to throw out the rule book when conventional tactics fail. And conventional tactics are failing spectacularly. Traditional high-altitude bombing against ships is a joke, hit rates hover around 1%. Japanese convoys have been slipping through for months, laughing at American bombers dropping their payloads from 20,000 feet, watching the explosions harmlessly bloom in the water hundreds of yards away. But Kenny has a secret weapon. Actually, he has two: innovation and a man named Paul "Pappy" Gunn. Major Paul Irving Gunn is not your average military engineer. He's a 43-year-old former airline pilot whose wife and 4 children are trapped in Japanese-occupied Philippines. The enemy isn't just an abstract concept to gun, they're the people who stole his family. And that personal hatred has turned him into the most dangerous aircraft modifier in the Pacific theater. Here's what Gunn did, and why it was absolutely revolutionary. He took the B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, a perfectly good aircraft designed to drop bombs from altitude, and turned it into something that had never existed before. First, he ripped out the bombardier's compartment in the nose. Then, he packed that space with 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. Not defensive guns, offensive weapons that could fire straight ahead while the pilot aimed the entire aircraft like a massive fighter plane. Let me put this in perspective. A single .50 caliber machine gun fires 850 rounds per minute. 8 of them, synchronized, could spit out 6,800 rounds every 60 seconds. That's 113 bullets every single second, each one capable of punching through steel plating. They called these modified aircraft commerce destroyers, but that name doesn't capture the sheer terror they would unleash. These weren't bombers anymore, they were flying battleships that could shred a destroyer's superstructure in seconds. But the aircraft modification was only half of Gunn's genius. The other half was the tactic he developed, skip bombing. Traditional bombing meant flying high, dropping bombs, and hoping for the best. Skip bombing meant flying dangerously low, we're talking 50 feet above the waves, racing toward enemy ships at over 200 miles per hour, and releasing bombs at the last possible second. The bombs would skip across the water's surface like stones thrown by a giant, maintaining their forward momentum before slamming into the side of enemy ships right at the waterline, the exact spot where armor was thinnest and damage would be most catastrophic. It was brilliant. It was terrifying. And it was about to turn the Bismarck Sea into a killing field. But before we see this weapon in action, I want to hear from you. We're talking about military innovation born from desperation and hatred. What's the most creative military tactic you've ever heard of? Ancient, modern, doesn't matter. Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one and some of your responses might make it into future videos. Now, let's watch genius and fury collide with devastating results. March 2, 1943. Admiral Kimura's convoy is making good time through the relatively calm waters of the Bismarck Sea. For a brief moment, it almost seems like the impossible gamble might pay off. Then Allied reconnaissance planes spot them. At Port Moresby, General Kenny receives the intelligence report and feels his pulse quicken. This is the moment he's been preparing for, the chance to test his revolutionary new tactics against a high-value target in the open ocean. The convoy consists of 8 transports packed with troops, equipment, and supplies, escorted by 8 destroyers. It's the largest Japanese naval operation in this sector in months. If Kenny can destroy it, he won't just win a battle, he'll potentially end Japan's ability to reinforce their New Guinea positions permanently. But Kenny faces a massive logistical challenge. The convoy is 400 miles from his airfields, at the very edge of his aircraft's combat range. His pilots will have maybe 30 minutes over the target before they have to turn for home. 1 pass, maybe 2 if they're lucky. There's no room for error, no second chances. Kenny calls together his squadron commanders. The plan he outlines is audacious to the point of insanity. The attack will come in waves. First, Australian Beaufighters will sweep in at wave-top height, their 420mm cannons targeting the ship's anti-aircraft positions and killing as many gunners as possible. This will suppress the convoy's defensive fire. Then come Kenny's modified B-25s, flying in at 50 feet, their 8 machine guns blazing, followed immediately by their skip bombing runs. The goal isn't just to sink ships, it's to create chaos, to shatter the convoy's formation, to turn an organized withdrawal into a panicked rout. Finally, high-altitude bombers will finish off any vessels still afloat, while P-38 Lightning fighters strafe the water for survivors trying to reach shore. It's a plan that could revolutionize naval warfare. Or it could get hundreds of Allied airmen killed if it fails. March 3, 1943. Dawn breaks clear and bright over the Bismarck Sea. Aboard the Japanese transports, soldiers are eating what many don't yet know will be their last breakfast. The convoy has made it through the night without air attack, and some are beginning to believe they might actually reach last safely. They are catastrophically wrong. At 6 a.m., 137 Allied aircraft, the largest coordinated airstrike in the Pacific War to date, take off from airfields across New Guinea and Australia. Pilots check their guns, adjust their bomb sights, and try not to think about the flak they're about to fly through. For many, this will be their first time seeing Kenny's new tactics in action. They have no idea they're about to witness the birth of modern anti-ship warfare. At 10 a.m., lookouts aboard Admiral Kimura's flagship spot the first wave of incoming aircraft. Air raid sirens begin to wail. Sailors sprint to their anti-aircraft positions. The Admiral orders evasive maneuvers, but it's too late. The Allies have achieved complete tactical surprise. What happens next unfolds with the terrible precision of a choreographed dance of death. The Australian bowfighters arrive first, screaming and so low their prop wash kicks up spray from the wave tops. Their 420mm cannons, each firing 600 rounds per minute, begin methodically shredding the Japanese ship's superstructures. The sound is indescribable. One Japanese survivor later wrote that it was like the sky itself tearing apart. Anti-aircraft gunners are cut down at their posts. Bridge windows explode in showers of glass. Officers are decapitated by cannon shells before they can give orders. But this is just the opening act. The real carnage begins when major guns modified B-25s arrive. Flying in formation at 50 feet above the water, 8 aircraft approach the convoy line abreast. From the Japanese perspective, it must have looked like the gates of hell opening. Each bomber's 8 machine guns begin firing simultaneously. That's 64 heavy machine guns spitting death at a rate of over 54,000 rounds per minute combined. The psychological effect is as devastating as the physical damage. Japanese sailors describe the sound as a giant canvas being torn apart by invisible hands. The machine gun fire doesn't just kill, it terrorizes, creating a wall of sound and fury that breaks men's minds before the bombs even hit. One transport, the Kyakusei Maru, takes the full concentrated fire of 2 B-25s. In 30 seconds, every man on her upper decks is dead or wounded. Her bridge is shot to pieces. Her anti-aircraft guns are twisted metal. And she's still afloat, the bombs haven't even been released yet. Then comes the skip bombing run. Flying at over 200 miles per hour just feet above the water, the B-25 pilots release their 500-pound bombs at the last possible second. The weapons skip across the water's surface like stones, maintaining their forward momentum as they slam into the ship's hulls right at the waterline. The results are catastrophic beyond imagination. Ships designed to withstand bombs dropped from 20,000 feet are completely unprepared for explosions at their most vulnerable point. The skip bombs punch through steel plating like it's paper, detonating inside the ship's hulls with devastating effect. The transport To Maru takes 3 skip bombs in rapid succession. The first explosion floods her engine room. The second detonates in her troop compartments, killing hundreds of soldiers instantly. The third tears her hull completely apart. She sinks in less than 4 minutes. Aboard his flagship, Admiral Kimura watches his carefully planned convoy disintegrate in real time. Within the first hour of attack, 5 of his 8 transports are either sinking or on fire. 2 of his destroyers are listing heavily, their crews abandoning ship. Kimura himself is wounded by machine gun fire that sweeps his bridge, killing his chief of staff and wounding several other officers. Blood running down his face, he gives the order he never wanted to give: all ships, abandon convoy formation. Every vessel for itself. But there is no escape. The Allied attack comes in relentless waves. As the modified B-25s complete their runs and turn for home, high-altitude bombers arrive to finish what the skip bombers started. P-38 Lightning strafe the water, hunting for survivors trying to swim to safety. By noon, the battle is effectively over. All 8 Japanese transports are sunk or sinking. 4 of the 8 destroyers are on their way to the bottom. The remaining destroyers, damaged and low on fuel, are fleeing northward at maximum speed, abandoning thousands of their countrymen to the mercy of the sea. The tactical innovation is complete and devastating. In less than 4 hours, Allied forces have achieved what no navy had ever accomplished before: the complete destruction of a heavily escorted convoy using primarily aircraft. Traditional naval warfare, the age of battleships and big guns, dies in the waters of the Bismarck Sea. But the battle isn't over. In fact, the most controversial and morally complex part is about to begin. March 3, 1943, 2 p.m. The guns have fallen silent, the bombs have stopped falling, and the Bismarck Sea is littered with debris, oil slicks, and thousands of Japanese survivors clinging to life preservers, pieces of wreckage, and overturned lifeboats. From the air, it looks like a maritime graveyard. Ships burn and settle slowly into the deep blue water. Men swim desperately toward anything that floats. Others float motionless, already claimed by the sea. Back at Port Moresby headquarters, General Kenny studies reconnaissance photographs of the battle's aftermath with grim satisfaction. The convoy has been annihilated, a strategic victory beyond his wildest expectations. But as he examines the images more closely, a new problem becomes apparent. There are survivors. Thousands of them. Kenny's intelligence officer estimates that between 2,500 and 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors are still alive in the water. Some are in lifeboats and life rafts. Others are swimming toward the New Guinea coast, still 50 miles away. Many are elite troops. If even a fraction of them make it to shore, they could regroup and continue fighting. This isn't just a tactical concern, it's a strategic nightmare. These aren't broken men fleeing in defeat. They're professional soldiers who've been trained to fight to the death. If they reach friendly territory, they'll become a guerrilla force behind Allied lines. Kenny faces a decision that will define his legacy and challenge every moral assumption about warfare. His deputy, Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead, points to the photographs of survivors floating in the water. "General," Whitehead says, "what are we going to do about them?" Kenny's response is immediate, cold, and utterly ruthless. "I want every goddamn Japanese in the water killed. I don't want any of them reaching shore to fight us again." Let that sink in for a moment. This isn't a heat-of-battle decision made in the fog of combat. This is a calculated order given by a senior military commander with full awareness of its implications. Kenny isn't ordering his pilots to sink more ships or destroy military equipment. He's ordering them to hunt human beings. But here's the moral complexity that makes this story so haunting. From a purely military perspective, Kenny's order might have been the right call. These aren't civilians, they're enemy combatants who pose a genuine threat if they survive. International law at the time didn't clearly protect shipwrecked military personnel the way it does today. And yet, ordering the deliberate killing of defenseless men in the water feels like crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed, even in war. Before we see what happens next, I want you to pause and consider, what would you have done in Kenny's position? You're responsible for thousands of Allied lives. You know that every enemy soldier who makes it ashore could kill your men later. Is it morally acceptable to order the killing of survivors to protect your own forces? There's no easy answer, and that's exactly why this story matters. Drop your thoughts in the comments, but remember, we're talking about real people making impossible decisions in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. March 3rd through March 6th, 1943. For 3 days and nights, the waters of the Bismarck Sea become a hunting ground unlike anything in military history. The mopping up operations, as they're euphemistically called, begin immediately after Kenny's order. B-25s, P-38 Lightnings, Australian Beaufighters, and even PT boats join the systematic search for survivors. The tactics are methodical and terrifying. Aircraft fly search patterns over the debris field, looking for any signs of life. When they spot survivors, whether in lifeboats, on rafts, or just floating in life preservers, they attack with machine guns and cannon fire. PT boats patrol at night, their crews using searchlights to hunt for swimmers in the darkness. When they find them, they open fire with .50 caliber machine guns at point-blank range. For the pilots carrying out these orders, the experience is psychologically devastating. These are men who joined the military to fight other soldiers, not to hunt defenseless survivors in the water. Many struggle with what they're being asked to do. One pilot writes in his diary, "Today we became something I never thought I'd become. We hunted men like animals. I keep telling myself they're the enemy, but they looked so helpless floating there." Another pilot describes the horror more bluntly, "It was like shooting fish in a barrel. They couldn't fight back. They couldn't run. They just died. I keep seeing their faces when I close my eyes." But orders are orders, and in wartime, disobedience can mean court-martial or worse. So the hunt continues. From the Japanese perspective, these 3 days represent pure terror. Survivors who initially felt relief at escaping their sinking ships quickly realize that their ordeal is far from over. The sky itself has become their enemy. One Japanese naval officer, floating on debris, later wrote, "We thought the battle was over when our ship sank. We were wrong. The real battle was just beginning, the battle to stay alive while the Americans hunted us like wild animals." Some survivors try to hide underwater when aircraft approach, holding their breath and praying to avoid detection. Others attempt to camouflage themselves with debris or oil. Many simply accept their fate with the stoic resignation that Japanese military culture demands. But survival is largely a matter of luck. Those who happen to be floating in areas the patrols miss live. Those who don't, die. The psychological toll on Allied forces varies widely. Some pilots and sailors rationalize their actions by focusing on the military necessity. These are enemy soldiers who could kill Americans if they survive. Every Japanese soldier they kill now is one fewer American soldier who dies later. Others are sickened by what they're doing but continue following orders out of discipline and loyalty to their comrades. They compartmentalize their feelings, trying to separate the person pulling the trigger from the moral implications of their actions. A few refuse to participate or find excuses to avoid the mission. Their commanding officers generally look the other way, understanding that asking men to hunt survivors pushes the boundaries of what soldiers can psychologically handle. But the majority carry out their orders, adding to a collective trauma that will haunt many of them for the rest of their lives. By March 6, the Bismarck Sea has returned to its deceptive calm. The oil slicks have dispersed, the debris has sunk or drifted away, and the water shows no signs of the carnage that occurred over the past 4 days. The final tally is staggering in its completeness. Of the 6,900 Japanese troops who set sail from Rabaul, fewer than 1,000 survived to reach shore or be rescued by submarines. Nearly 3,000 are confirmed dead, most killed in the water after their ships were sunk. Allied losses are minimal by comparison: 13 airmen killed, 5 aircraft destroyed. From a purely military standpoint, it's the most lopsided victory in the history of naval warfare. The strategic impact is immediate and decisive. Japan never again attempts to send a large convoy through the Bismarck Sea. Their ability to reinforce New Guinea is permanently crippled, effectively sealing the fate of their remaining garrisons on the island. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Allied Commander in the Pacific, hails the battle as a masterpiece of tactical innovation. Military historians will later call it the engagement that changed naval warfare forever, proving that aircraft could not just threaten ships but annihilate entire fleets. But the moral reckoning is just beginning. In the immediate aftermath, Allied propaganda presents the battle as a clean victory: ships sunk, enemy forces destroyed, mission accomplished. The systematic killing of survivors is mentioned only obliquely, if at all. Pilots and sailors are ordered not to discuss the mopping up operations with reporters or in letters home. What happened in the water stays in the water. However, word eventually leaks out. War correspondents hear whispered accounts from traumatized airmen. Intelligence officers compile reports that can't ignore the systematic nature of the survivor killings. The moral implications become impossible to ignore when viewed in the cold light of peacetime analysis. Let me share some of the personal accounts from the men who carried out these orders, because their words reveal the human cost of that decision in March 1943. Captain John Mitchell, B-25 pilot, wrote years later, "We were told it was military necessity. Maybe it was. But necessity doesn't make it easier to live with. I can still see them in the water, looking up at us. Some waved, thinking we were coming to rescue them. Then we opened fire." Lieutenant James Murphy, P-38 pilot, kept a private journal throughout the war, day 3 of hunting survivors. "I'm not sure what I've become. My mother raised me to believe in right and wrong. But out here, those concepts seem meaningless. We do what we're ordered to do, and we try not to think about it too much." Perhaps most haunting is the account of Seaman First Class Robert Chin, serving aboard a PT boat. The searchlight would pick them out of the water, and they'd freeze like deer caught in headlights. Some would try to dive, but they were exhausted and couldn't stay under long. We had our orders. But those orders didn't make it any easier to pull the trigger. Not all the accounts are filled with regret. Some veterans remained convinced throughout their lives that they had done the right thing under impossible circumstances. Master Sergeant Paul Henderson, B-25 gunner, argued until his death in 1987, those Japanese soldiers would have killed Americans if they'd made it to shore. Everyone we stopped in the water was an American life saved. I sleep fine at night knowing that. The Japanese survivors who lived to tell their stories paint a picture of unimaginable terror and suffering. Commander Hiroshi Watanabe, one of the few officers to survive, wrote in his post-war memoirs, "For 3 days, death came from the sky. We learned to fear the sound of aircraft engines more than sharks or drowning. At least sharks and the sea don't hunt with purpose." The Battle of the Bismarck Sea occurred in a legal gray area that wouldn't exist today. In 1943, international law did not explicitly protect shipwrecked military personnel the way it protected civilians or clearly defined prisoners of war. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 established some rules for naval warfare, but they didn't specifically address the treatment of enemy survivors in the water. Military necessity was considered a valid justification for actions that might otherwise be questionable. However, the systematic nature of the survivor killings troubled many legal experts even at the time. The deliberate hunting of defenseless men, even enemy soldiers, seemed to cross ethical lines that most military professionals were uncomfortable crossing. These concerns would eventually contribute to the 1949 Geneva Convention, which explicitly forbids attacks on shipwrecked persons, whether civilian or military, unless they're directly participating in hostile acts. Article 12 of the First Geneva Convention now states clearly, members of the armed forces and other persons, who are at sea and shipwrecked shall be respected and protected in all circumstances. In other words, what happened in the Bismarck Sea would be considered a war crime under modern international law. But in 1943, it existed in a moral and legal twilight zone. The post-war Tokyo war crimes trials prosecuted Japanese officials for various atrocities, but no Allied personnel were charged for the Bismarck Sea survivor killings. The victors, as they say, write the history books, and define the war crimes. This double standard has troubled historians and legal scholars for decades. If systematic killing of survivors is wrong when the Japanese do it, how can it be justified when Americans do it? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, likely lies in the fundamental nature of total war. When entire nations are fighting for survival, moral boundaries that seem absolute in peacetime become negotiable under extreme pressure. That doesn't make the killings right, but it might make them understandable within the context of their time. The tactical innovations demonstrated at the Bismarck Sea had immediate and lasting impacts on naval warfare worldwide. Skip bombing became standard anti-ship doctrine for the remainder of World War II. The concept of aircraft as primary anti-naval weapons was proven beyond doubt. But the moral questions raised by the battle's aftermath would reverberate through military ethics for decades. During the Korean War, American pilots faced similar situations when attacking North Korean and Chinese supply convoys. Many explicitly referenced the Bismarck Sea precedent when deciding whether to strafe survivors. The Vietnam War saw numerous incidents where the line between combatants and non-combatants became blurred, often with tragic consequences. Military lawyers began paying much closer attention to the rules of engagement and the treatment of enemy personnel in vulnerable situations. Modern military training includes extensive instruction on the laws of war, much of it directly inspired by World War II incidents like the Bismarck Sea survivor killings. Military personnel are taught that orders to commit war crimes must be disobeyed, regardless of the potential consequences. The phrase, "I was just following orders," is no longer considered a valid legal defense, partly due to cases like this one where ordinary soldiers were asked to do extraordinary and morally questionable things. Intelligence agencies and special operations forces still grapple with similar moral dilemmas in the modern era. When does military necessity justify actions that would be criminal under other circumstances? How do you balance immediate tactical advantages against long-term moral and legal consequences? The ghost of the Bismarck Sea haunts these discussions, serving as both a cautionary tale and a reminder that war forces impossible choices on ordinary people. For the men who participated in the Bismarck Sea battle and its aftermath, the moral reckoning lasted far longer than the 3 days of combat. Many veterans struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in the 1940s and 1950s, psychological trauma from combat was poorly understood and rarely treated. Some found solace in veterans' organizations, where they could talk to other men who had faced similar moral challenges. Others buried their experiences deep and never spoke of them again, even to their families. Captain Robert Hayes, who flew multiple strafing runs against survivors, never told his wife or children about his war experiences. His son discovered the truth only after reading his father's posthumously published war diary. "Dad carried this burden alone for 40 years. I wish he'd felt he could share it with us." A few veterans became anti-war activists, using their experiences to argue against military solutions to international conflicts. Their message was simple: war makes monsters of good men, and the psychological cost is often greater than the strategic benefit. Others became stronger supporters of military action, arguing that half measures and moral squeamishness only prolong conflicts and increase overall casualties. Better to be ruthless and end wars quickly than to be merciful and let them drag on. Perhaps most interestingly, some veterans found purpose in advocating for stronger international law and military ethics training. They used their experiences to help develop the rules and regulations that would prevent future generations of soldiers from facing the same impossible moral choices. Their message: if we must fight wars, let's at least fight them with clear rules about what's acceptable and what isn't. Now, I want to pause here and ask for your thoughts, because this is where the story gets really complex. We've heard from the pilots, the sailors, the survivors, and the historians. But what's your take? Were the Americans right to prioritize military effectiveness over moral considerations? Or does winning a battle never justify the systematic killing of defenseless enemies? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't hold back. These are exactly the kinds of difficult moral questions that we need to wrestle with if we want to understand history, and prevent its worst mistakes from being repeated. While historians focus on the tactical innovations and moral implications of the Bismarck Sea battle, there's another aspect that deserves attention: its psychological impact on Japanese strategic planning. The complete annihilation of the convoy sent shockwaves through the Imperial Japanese Navy that went far beyond the simple loss of ships and men. It demonstrated that American air power had reached a level of effectiveness that made large-scale reinforcement operations virtually impossible. In Tokyo, Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, studied the Bismarck Sea battle reports with growing alarm. The loss of 8 transports and 4 destroyers was bad enough, but the casualty reports were catastrophic. Nearly 70% of the troops aboard the convoy had died, most of them killed in the water after their ships were sunk. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a massacre that demonstrated the futility of challenging American air supremacy in daylight. The psychological impact extended to Japanese ground forces throughout the Pacific. If Tokyo couldn't safely reinforce major garrisons, what hope did isolated outposts have? Morale plummeted as Japanese soldiers realized they were truly alone, fighting a war that their homeland could no longer effectively support. Many units began preparing for final banzai charges, knowing that death in battle was preferable to slow starvation. The battle also marked the end of Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations in the South Pacific. Without the ability to move large numbers of troops and supplies, Japanese forces were reduced to purely defensive positions. This strategic paralysis allowed Allied forces to bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions, leaving them to wither on the vine, while more important objectives were captured elsewhere. Perhaps most importantly, the Bismarck Sea demonstrated to Japanese military leaders that American industrial production had reached levels they simply couldn't match. The number of aircraft, the quantity of ammunition, the coordination of the attack, all of it pointed to an enemy with resources that dwarfed Japan's own capabilities. Some Japanese officers began quietly discussing surrender scenarios, though such conversations were still considered treasonous in 1943. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how revolutionary the tactical innovations at Bismarck Sea really were, because they literally changed the nature of naval warfare forever. Before March 1943, conventional wisdom held that aircraft were useful for reconnaissance and harassment, but couldn't reliably sink well-defended warships. The Standard Doctrine called for high-altitude bombing with limited effectiveness, followed by torpedo attacks that required pilots to fly straight and level through walls of anti-aircraft fire. Major gun skip bombing techniques shattered these assumptions. By approaching at wave-top level and releasing bombs that maintained their forward momentum, Allied pilots could achieve accuracy rates of over 60%, 60 times better than conventional high-altitude bombing. But the real breakthrough was the psychological component. The combination of low-level strafing followed immediately by skip bombing created a level of terror and chaos that traditional naval defenses couldn't handle. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners were trained to track high-altitude bombers with predictable flight paths. They had no idea how to engage multiple aircraft coming in at 50 feet, firing machine guns while simultaneously preparing to release bombs. The sensory overload was overwhelming: the roar of aircraft engines just overhead, the hammering of dozens of machine guns, the whistling of bombs skipping across the water, followed by explosions that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Within months, every Allied air force in the Pacific was adopting similar tactics. The British Royal Air Force began modifying their own aircraft for low-level anti-ship attacks. The Soviet Union requested technical details about skip bombing for use against German shipping in the Baltic Sea. Even the Germans, despite being on the receiving end of similar attacks, began developing their own low-level anti-shipping tactics for use against Allied convoys. The age of the battleship, massive armored vessels designed to fight other massive armored vessels, effectively ended in the Bismarck Sea. Naval architects realized that no amount of armor could protect against aircraft that could attack from any direction with devastating accuracy. Future naval design would prioritize speed, maneuverability, and anti-aircraft defenses over heavy armor and big guns. The aircraft carrier, not the battleship, became the new queen of naval warfare. While much of this story focuses on American innovation and moral complexity, we shouldn't ignore the extraordinary courage displayed by Japanese personnel during the battle and its aftermath. Admiral Kimura, bleeding from machine gun wounds, remained on his bridge directing rescue operations even as his flagship was sinking beneath him. He was eventually pulled from the water by his own men and transferred to a destroyer, but refused medical treatment until all wounded personnel had been cared for. Captain Shigeki Yamamoto of the transport Io Maru kept his ship's engines running and continued evasive maneuvers even after multiple bomb hits had flooded his engine room. His actions allowed 3 other transports to escape the initial attack, though all would eventually be sunk by follow-up strikes. Perhaps most remarkably, hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors risked their own lives to rescue shipmates from the water, even while under constant air attack. Life preservers were shared, wounded men were supported by those who could still swim, and officers organized survivor groups to maximize everyone's chances of rescue. Petty Officer Takashi Nakamura, floating on debris from his sunken destroyer, later wrote, "Even in the water, surrounded by death, our men maintained discipline and looked after each other. The Americans may have destroyed our ships, but they could not destroy our spirit." These acts of heroism make the subsequent systematic killing of survivors even more morally complex. The men being hunted in the water weren't cowards or war criminals, they were professional soldiers who had fought with skill and courage, only to find themselves defenseless against an enemy who had decided they were too dangerous to be allowed to live. One aspect of this story that often gets overlooked is the human cost beyond the immediate casualties. The 3,000 men killed in the Bismarck Sea left behind wives, children, parents, and siblings who would never know exactly how their loved ones died. Japanese military culture emphasized death before dishonor, and families were typically told that their sons, husbands, and fathers had died gloriously in battle. The reality, that many had been systematically hunted while defenseless in the water, was considered too shameful to acknowledge. For decades after the war, Japanese families received only vague official notifications, died in naval action in the South Pacific. No details, no context, no closure. It wasn't until the 1970s, when some American veterans began publishing their memoirs, that Japanese families started learning the truth about what happened in the Bismarck Sea. The revelation was traumatic for many families. Mrs. Akiko Tanaka, whose husband died aboard the transport Kyakusei Maru, said in a 1985 interview, "For 30 years, I believed my husband died fighting honorably for the emperor. Learning that he was shot in the water like an animal, it changed everything I thought I knew about the war." Some families felt betrayed by their own government's deception. Others directed their anger toward the Americans who had ordered the killings. Many simply tried to forget, choosing to remember their loved ones as they had lived rather than how they had died. General Kenny never apologized for his order to kill survivors, and he spent the rest of his life defending the decision. In his 1949 memoir, General Kenny reports, he wrote, "Those Japanese soldiers were not helpless civilians. They were trained killers who would have regrouped and fought against my men if given the chance. Every enemy soldier we stopped in the water was an American life saved on some future battlefield." Kenny's position was supported by many senior Allied commanders, including General MacArthur, who praised the Bismarck Sea operation as a masterpiece of air-sea coordination that shortened the war and saved countless Allied lives. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of Pacific Fleet Forces, was more ambivalent. In private correspondence discovered after his death, he wrote, "Kenny's tactics were effective, but they pushed the boundaries of what civilized nations should do, even in wartime." The debate among Allied leadership reflected a broader tension within American military culture. On one hand, there was a strong tradition of fighting clean wars with clear moral boundaries. On the other hand, the Pacific War had already demonstrated Japanese willingness to fight with fanatical determination, making traditional concepts of surrender and mercy seem naive. General Curtis LeMay, who would later order the firebombing of Japanese cities, put it bluntly, the Japanese started this war with a sneak attack that killed thousands of Americans. They forfeited any right to gentlemanly treatment when they chose to fight outside the rules of civilized warfare. The systematic nature of the survivor killings at Bismarck Sea caught the attention of military psychiatrists, who began studying the psychological effects on the personnel who carried out the orders. Dr. Roy Grinker, a U.S. Army psychiatrist, conducted interviews with dozens of pilots and aircrew members in the months following the battle. His classified reports, declassified only in the 1990s, reveal the complex psychological impact of the mopping up operations. Some personnel showed immediate signs of what would later be called moral injury, psychological damage caused by perpetrating, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts that violate moral beliefs. Symptoms included depression, anxiety, insomnia, and intrusive thoughts about the survivors they had killed. Others displayed what psychologists termed moral disengagement, a psychological defense mechanism where individuals justify morally questionable actions by dehumanizing victims or emphasizing higher purposes. Most interestingly, Grinker found that personnel who participated in the initial ship attacks showed fewer psychological symptoms than those who participated only in the survivor hunts. The pilots who sank ships could rationalize their actions as legitimate military targets, while those who hunted men in the water struggled more with moral justification. These studies would eventually contribute to modern military psychology and the development of programs designed to help personnel cope with the moral complexities of warfare. News of the systematic killing of survivors eventually reached Japanese military command through intelligence reports and survivor testimonies. The Imperial Japanese Navy's response was swift and brutal. If Americans were going to hunt Japanese survivors, Japan would reciprocate. Within weeks of the Bismarck Sea battle, Japanese submarines began systematically attacking Allied merchant ships and then surfacing to machine gun survivors in the water. Japanese aircraft started strafing Allied lifeboats and life rafts found floating in the Pacific. This escalation created a vicious cycle of retaliation that made the Pacific War even more brutal than it had already been. Both sides began treating enemy survivors as legitimate military targets, abandoning any pretense of mercy or humanitarian consideration. The psychological effect on both Japanese and Allied personnel was devastating. Sailors and airmen on both sides knew that being shot down or sunk no longer meant potential rescue, it meant almost certain death, whether from the sea or from enemy guns. Some Japanese commanders went even further, ordering the execution of captured Allied airmen who had participated in anti-shipping operations. The logic was simple: if Americans would hunt defenseless Japanese in the water, captured American pilots deserved no better treatment. This cycle of escalating brutality would continue until the end of the war, with both sides committing atrocities that would have been unthinkable in the early months of the conflict. The Bismarck Sea massacre was enabled not just by tactical innovation, but by technological advances that made unprecedented coordination and communication possible. Allied forces used newly developed radar systems to track the Japanese convoy with precision, ensuring that attacking aircraft could find their targets even in poor weather conditions. Radio communication allowed real-time coordination between different attack waves, maximizing the effectiveness of each strike. Most importantly, improved aircraft manufacturing meant that Allied forces could sustain losses that would have been crippling earlier in the war. The 137 aircraft that participated in the initial attack represented just a fraction of available Allied air power in the Pacific. Japan, by contrast, was already struggling with aircraft shortages and pilot training deficits. The loss of experienced aircrew from the convoy's escort fighters was almost as damaging as the loss of the ships themselves. This technological superiority extended to weapon systems as well. The .50 caliber machine guns that proved so devastating in the water hunts were reliable, accurate, and available in seemingly unlimited quantities. Japanese survivors reported that the firing seemed to go on forever, a testament to American industrial capacity. The skip bombs themselves were a product of American manufacturing efficiency. Each 500-pound weapon was precision manufactured to exact specifications, ensuring consistent performance across hundreds of individual attacks. The legal and moral questions raised by the Bismarck Sea survivor killings contributed directly to the development of modern international humanitarian law. The 1949 Geneva Conventions, negotiated in the aftermath of World War II, include specific provisions protecting shipwrecked persons that were directly inspired by incidents like the Bismarck Sea battle. Article 12 of the First Geneva Convention explicitly states that shipwrecked members of armed forces shall be respected and protected in all circumstances, and may not be attacked unless they are directly participating in hostilities. Article 16 requires that parties to a conflict search for and collect the shipwrecked, wounded, and sick at sea, regardless of nationality. These provisions were specifically designed to prevent future incidents of systematic survivor killing. The development of these laws wasn't without controversy. Military leaders from several nations argued that protecting enemy survivors could interfere with legitimate military operations and endanger their own forces. However, the moral revulsion generated by World War II atrocities, including incidents like the Bismarck Sea killings, created sufficient political momentum to establish clear humanitarian protections. Modern military training includes extensive instruction on these laws, and military personnel are taught that orders to attack protected persons must be refused, regardless of the military necessity claimed by commanders. The phrase, superior orders, is no longer considered a valid defense for war crimes, partly due to cases like the Bismarck Sea where ordinary soldiers were ordered to commit acts that violated basic humanitarian principles. For decades after the war, most veterans who participated in the Bismarck Sea survivor hunts remained silent about their experiences. Military censorship, personal shame, and social expectations all contributed to a conspiracy of silence that lasted well into the 1970s. The first major break in this silence came in 1973, when former B-25 pilot Captain Robert Mitchell published a memoir titled Hunting Season that described the systematic killing of survivors in graphic detail. Mitchell's book created a firestorm of controversy. Veterans organizations accused him of betraying his comrades and giving ammunition to America's enemies. Military historians questioned his accuracy and motives. But other veterans began coming forward with their own accounts, corroborating Mitchell's basic narrative and adding details that had been suppressed for 30 years. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Master Sergeant James Rodriguez, a B-25 gunner who had suffered from nightmares and depression since the war. In a 1975 television interview, Rodriguez broke down while describing his experiences. "They told us it was military necessity. Maybe it was. But I've been living with what we did for 30 years, and I can tell you that necessity doesn't make it right. Those men in the water, they weren't soldiers anymore. They were just human beings trying to stay alive." These revelations forced a national conversation about the moral complexities of warfare and the psychological costs borne by the men and women who fight America's wars. Some Americans were horrified to learn about the systematic nature of the survivor killings. Others defended the actions as necessary measures taken during a total war against a fanatical enemy. Today's U.S. military has learned significant lessons from incidents like the Bismarck Sea survivor killings. Modern military ethics training includes extensive case studies of World War II moral dilemmas, and personnel are taught to recognize and resist unlawful orders. The military's Law of War program specifically addresses the treatment of enemy personnel in vulnerable situations, including shipwrecked survivors, wounded combatants, and prisoners of war. Perhaps more importantly, modern military culture emphasizes the importance of moral courage, the willingness to do the right thing even when it conflicts with orders from superiors or peer pressure from comrades. Officers are taught that they have a positive duty to refuse unlawful orders and to report war crimes committed by their subordinates or superiors. This represents a fundamental shift from the World War II era, when questioning orders was considered insubordination. The military has also invested heavily in psychological support for personnel who witness or participate in morally complex situations. Mental health professionals are embedded with combat units, and soldiers are encouraged to seek help for moral injury and combat stress. These changes don't guarantee that future incidents like the Bismarck Sea killings won't occur, but they create institutional safeguards that didn't exist during World War II. Even today, nearly 80 years after the battle, families on both sides continue searching for answers about what happened in the Bismarck Sea. Japanese families have formed organizations dedicated to researching the fate of relatives who disappeared during the battle. They've interviewed American veterans, studied declassified documents, and even commissioned underwater surveys of the battle site. American families face their own challenges in understanding their relatives' experiences. Many World War II veterans never spoke about the war, taking their secrets to the grave. Children and grandchildren often discover their relatives' participation in controversial operations only through military records, memoirs by other veterans, or family documents found after a veteran's death. These discoveries can be traumatic for families who grew up believing their relatives were unambiguous heroes. Learning that a beloved grandfather participated in the systematic killing of defenseless enemies forces a reckoning with complex moral realities. Some families choose to focus on their relatives' service and sacrifice while acknowledging the moral ambiguity of specific actions. Others struggle to reconcile their personal love and respect with actions they find morally indefensible. Historians continue to debate the moral and strategic implications of the Bismarck Sea battle more than 8 decades after it occurred. Some argue that the systematic killing of survivors was an inexcusable war crime that violated basic humanitarian principles regardless of the military context. They point to the development of international law after the war as evidence that the global community recognized the need to protect vulnerable combatants. Others contend that the actions were justified by the extraordinary circumstances of total war against an enemy that had shown little regard for international law or humanitarian considerations. They argue that applying modern moral standards to World War II decisions is anachronistic and fails to account for the life-or-death nature of the strategic situation. A third group of historians takes a more nuanced position, arguing that the Bismarck Sea killings were understandable within their historical context while still being morally problematic. They emphasize the importance of studying such incidents not to assign blame, but to understand how ordinary people can be led to commit extraordinary acts under extreme circumstances. So what can we learn from this dark chapter of World War II history? What relevance does a 1943 battle have for the moral challenges facing military personnel and civilians today? First, the Bismarck Sea story demonstrates how quickly moral boundaries can shift during armed conflict. Actions that would be unthinkable in peacetime can seem not just acceptable but necessary when lives are at stake and national survival is threatened. Second, it shows the importance of clear legal and moral frameworks for guiding behavior during crisis situations. The absence of specific international law protecting shipwrecked military personnel contributed to the moral confusion surrounding the survivor killings. Third, it illustrates the long-term psychological costs of morally ambiguous actions. Many of the personnel who participated in the survivor hunt struggled with the psychological consequences for the rest of their lives. Perhaps most importantly, the story reminds us that moral courage, the willingness to do the right thing even under extreme pressure, is not automatic. It must be cultivated, supported, and reinforced through training, leadership, and institutional culture. The men who carried out the order to hunt survivors weren't monsters or psychopaths. They were ordinary people placed in an extraordinary situation without clear moral guidance or institutional support for resistance. So, after examining all the evidence, testimonies, and moral arguments, what's the final verdict on the Battle of the Bismarck Sea and the systematic killing of survivors that followed? The answer is that there is no simple verdict. History rarely provides clear-cut moral judgments, especially when it comes to the complex realities of warfare. From a purely military perspective, General Kenny's order was strategically sound. It eliminated a potential threat, demonstrated Allied determination, and contributed to the eventual Allied victory in the Pacific. The tactical innovations developed during the battle revolutionized naval warfare and saved countless Allied lives in subsequent operations. From a humanitarian perspective, the systematic hunting of defenseless survivors violated basic moral principles that most people, regardless of their political or cultural background, would consider fundamental to human dignity. From a legal perspective, the actions occupied a gray area that international law has since clarified, making similar orders illegal under modern military codes and international humanitarian law. From a psychological perspective, the orders imposed devastating moral injury on many of the personnel who carried them out, demonstrating that winning battles doesn't necessarily mean avoiding long-term human costs. Perhaps the most important lesson is that war creates moral complexity that defies easy answers. The men who fought in the Bismarck Sea, American, Australian, and Japanese, were neither pure heroes nor irredeemable villains. They were human beings making impossible choices under extraordinary pressure. Understanding their stories doesn't require us to excuse their actions or ignore moral considerations. But it does require us to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that good people can do terrible things when circumstances push them beyond normal moral boundaries. The real tragedy of the Bismarck Sea isn't just the 3,000 men who died in the water, or the pilots who carried psychological scars for the rest of their lives, or the families who were left with unanswered questions for decades. The real tragedy is that it happened at all, that human civilization had reached a point where systematic killing of defenseless enemies could seem not just militarily necessary, but morally defensible to otherwise decent people. This story matters because the moral dilemmas faced by those World War II veterans haven't disappeared with the passage of time. Modern military personnel, intelligence operatives, and even civilians face similar choices when national security conflicts with humanitarian principles. We can't change what happened in the Bismarck Sea, but we can learn from it. We can demand better moral education for our military leaders. We can support stronger international law protecting vulnerable populations. We can create institutional safeguards that make it easier for individuals to resist unlawful or immoral orders. Most importantly, we can refuse to look away from uncomfortable truths about our own history. The Bismarck Sea story isn't just about what they did in 1943, it's about what we might do when faced with similar choices. That's why I want to hear from you. After learning about this battle and its moral complexities, what do you think? Was General Kenny's order justified by military necessity, or was it an inexcusable war crime? How should we balance strategic effectiveness against humanitarian principles? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, but remember, we're not just discussing ancient history. We're wrestling with moral questions that remain relevant today. Your perspective matters because these kinds of decisions are still being made by people just like us, in circumstances we hope we never face. If this story has challenged your thinking about war, morality, and the complexity of human behavior, then it's done its job. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because there are more untold stories from history that deserve our attention and moral consideration. Share this video with someone who enjoys thought-provoking historical content. These are the kinds of stories that need to be told, discussed, and remembered, not because they're comfortable, but because they're necessary. Thanks for taking this difficult journey with me. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll dive into another piece of hidden history that challenges everything you thought you knew about war, morality, and the human condition. Until then, keep asking the hard questions. The world needs more people willing to wrestle with moral complexity rather than settling for simple answers. That's a wrap.